Well, of course, it's been a busy week in the news with lots of stories. Some bipartisan work in Congress has been at the forefront with the debt ceiling legislation. Also, President Joe Biden announcing that he will seek re-election in 2024 after some skepticism that may happen, given his age, given the fact that he would be 86 at the conclusion of his second term, assuming that he is victorious in 2024. Joining me now to discuss some of the latest is Republican South Carolina Congresswoman Nancy Mace. Thanks so much for making the time.
Wyatt, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you tonight and your audience.
Of course. Let's just start out with President Joe Biden running again in 2024. Some polling suggests that he is favorite at this point amongst Democrats to be their nominee. A lot of polling on the Republican side suggests that President Donald Trump is favorite to be the Republican nominee. What do you make of the potentiality of a Trump-Biden rematch and the fact that there seems to be, at least as of right now, little enthusiasm for that?
Well, for either of them. And I would say that, too, it's still very, very early. And not all of the candidates who are going to be running in the 2024 election are announced candidates yet. There may be more, there may be less people that jump in. And I would tell you, just from a timeline standpoint, I really don't think the American people on either side of the aisle will be paying attention until after the summer, after Labor Day, as we get closer to the primaries in Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina. But both sides, the majority of Republican primary voters and Democrat primary voters, they don't want those who are polling in the lead right now. So it's like 60-40 of those who want somebody else for their party.
And I guess there is, of course, as you mentioned, little enthusiasm on both sides for a Trump-Biden rematch moving into 2024. I mean, there's the age factor for President Biden. President Trump isn't much younger than Joe Biden either. Do you think it is time, particularly yourself as a Republican on the Republican side of things, to perhaps look for someone who can appeal to, a broader demographic of people, perhaps someone who is not someone like Donald Trump? Do you think that is an option for the Republican Party at this point?
Well, I think both sides want to look for somebody who can be forward thinking, who will bring more people into their own individual respective parties. I think the same could be said for both sides of the aisle. And when I look at 2024, I want to see more diversity on our ticket. I would love to see a woman, for example, and I haven't endorsed yet for 2024, but we have real opportunity here to show leadership for the country, to heal our nation. And that's what primaries are really about. They're really important because that means that the Republican voters and Democrat voters get to pick their nominee and go through a vigorous primary process, debates, and all of that, and traveling through every one of the states and answering tough questions to really vet and get the best nominee for the party.
And when looking at some of the key issues that will be at stake, obviously you have the issue of leadership, just as an example, who the two people are, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, or whoever is chosen as the two parties' respective nominees. You have the issue of how will they actually lead the United States. But then, of course, you also have some of the more key policy issues. As of recently, of course, the debt ceiling, something that has been a great topic of discussion this week in particular. What should, from your perspective, the candidates who are running in 2024 be putting a focus on, and what issues for yourself are most prevalent and most important to be addressed?
Well, number one is inflation, right? So the cost of goods, whether you're talking about milk or eggs or bacon, or gasoline, the cost of everything is up right now because of inflation. So number one, that should be the number one issue that we talk about. When you're talking about inflation and tackling inflation, you have to also be talking about how we're going to cut taxes, how we're going to grow the economy. You do that by cutting taxes. You do that by cutting spending. You do that by balancing the budget. And so having someone who understands all of those things and what it's going to take to get beyond the debt that we have today. We have a $31 trillion debt. $8 trillion of our debt was added by President Trump, $4 trillion so far in his term, halfway through his term, added by President Biden. That's $12 trillion over the last 6 years. And you just can't keep doing the same thing you've always done and expect to get a different result. The second issue, the number two issue that I hear about in our district, in our state, and really across the country is the issue of abortion. And I would tell any candidate who's running for office is that women are watching.
And I want to talk a little bit about bipartisan work in the United States Congress. I mean, you have, progressive members of Congress, people like Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or many others like Jamal Bowman. And then you have people who are very much conservative members of Congress, very quite right-wing members of Congress like Matt Gaetz or Marjorie Taylor Greene. How can, more moderate members of Congress or really any member of Congress actually work together to advance, more bipartisan legislation, something that I know is a key issue for you personally?
Yeah, I know a lot of people like to label me as a moderate. I would not categorize my brand of politics as moderate. I would say fiscally conservative, socially sensible, socially moderate, of course. But as a conservative, as someone who prides themselves on being fiscally conservative, being a constitutional conservative, I have found a way to reach across the aisle to get things done, whether that's getting funding for roads and bridges or flooding and stormwater projects in our district, whether it's advocating for women or safer communities, advocating for a balanced budget, for example, all those things. I found a way to reach across the aisle to get things done. And I actually have worked with some progressives, including another member of Congress by the name of Ro Khanna from California. He and I have done several pieces of legislation, particularly in cybersecurity, that even the President Biden, have signed into law. And so it's really, when you find where there are areas that you agree with on the other side of the aisle, that's where you can really dig in and get to work and try to pass bills that can become law.
And of course, people will remember Ro Khanna was on the show actually just recently. When you look
He's
to
great. He's great.
he is. When you look at the issue, of course, again, of the debt ceiling, something that has been talked about, quite lengthily over the course of the past week. It is an issue that I'm sure for many Americans is something that they are thinking about, given the rising cost of living, not just in the US, but around the world, specifically on the cost of living. What concrete actions can actually be taken to reduce the cost of living without having to, raise deficits, raise spending, which would ultimately, in the end, put more of a burden on the American people?
Right. Well, looking at how and when we've raised interest rates, that has an effect on the cost of goods in the market. But in order to tackle the $31 trillion of debt, you have to grow the economy bigger and better than the debt that we have right now. And so last week, or a couple of days ago, we heard that we thought GDP would grow by 2%. It grew by half that. So earnings were down. The market was down briefly because of that. So there are a couple of things that you have to do to tackle the cost of anything, whether that's the cost of living, the cost of milk, the cost of gas. And lowering taxes helps to curb and stem the tide of rising inflation. Getting untenable spending under control at the federal level helps stem the tide of rising inflation. Getting a better grasp and a handle on our supply chain and not having the issues we had during COVID-19, making sure our ports are open 24 hours a day, that they're doing gate turns every day, that we're getting and diversifying where we source our goods and materials to make things in this country, being less reliant on China and maybe being more reliant on nations who are closer to us, Mexico, Central and South America, even our European allies, but finding ways to shore up the supply chain. The other thing that we can do also is becoming energy independent. Whether you like the former president or not, we were net exporters of oil and natural gas. We're not today. We're net importers now with Biden in the presidency. And so looking at ways to grow energy, whether it's green energy, natural gas, and oil products, petroleum, et cetera, up until we're all green, because eventually we all will be running on batteries, I imagine. But until that time, really utilizing the natural resources that we have here so we become energy independent. So those are a couple of things that if I could wave my magic wand right now, those are the things that I would tackle in order to tackle the cost of living, the cost of anything really in this country.
And just before we conclude, sticking on with this issue, you hear from a lot of world leaders, in particular, a lot of leaders from right around the globe when, talking about the issue of inflation, when talking about the rising cost of living, that it is an issue of global supply chains, something that was emphasized over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic in relation to the goods that can be imported, exported into the United States and into other countries as well. To what extent is the issue of the cost of living, an issue of supply chains versus an issue of, spending, et cetera, something that you hear people like House Speaker Kevin
It
McCarthy?
could be, yeah, it could be supply chain, it could be spending, it could be over-regulating a market. So for example, during COVID-19, in some parts of the country, especially in the South, houses, the sales of houses were going through the roof. You'd sell a house in 24 hours, sight unseen. But houses couldn't close on the deal in cases like South Carolina because of regulations where it had to be a certain grade of plastic or metal on the water meter, for example. And because we had supply chain shortages of that particular material, we couldn't have the covers for the water meters and electrical utility meters. And so houses were delayed in their closing so those deals were slower in happening in the sales cycle. So sometimes over regulating a market can also incur and could also drive inflation and cause prices to go up, and the cost of housing. For example, in my district, in some places, a lot of places, to rent a 3-bedroom apartment, Wyatt, it costs about $5,000 a month. That's a lot of money for a family of 4.
Okay, perfect. We'll leave it there. That is Republican South Carolina Congresswoman Nancy Mace. Thanks so much for making the time. Great chatting with you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Wyatt, so much. You have a great week.